Good morning, colleagues. Thank you and a warm welcome to all of you to the PURCO Essay Ponder Virtual Presentation Series. We will commence with a short presentation lasting about 30 minutes, a question and answer session of 10 minutes, and conclude with the lucky prize draw. You are welcome to field questions in the chat box during the presentation, which will be answered in the end. This morning, Clem Sunter will enlighten us on a trendy and very interesting topic from his book titled Thinking the Future, Perspectives from the Shoulders of Giants. Isaac Newton said, "If I have seen further than others, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." In their best-selling book, Thinking the Future, Clem Sunter and Mitch Ilbury teach the futurist art of decision-making by reimagining concepts from history's greatest thinkers. Clem's presentation this morning draws on his book to show you how to weigh up to your future and harness the power of scenario planning towards the future you want and avoid the ones you don't. Clem Sunter is an internationally acclaimed scenario planner and futurologist. He reads politics, philosophy, and economics at Oxford University and is a former CEO and chairman at mining giant Anglo American. He was one of the driving forces behind the South African high-road, low road scenarios that helped pave the way towards the country's peaceful transition to democracy. Clem is the author of 17 acclaimed business books on leadership, crisis management, planning, and strategy, and has given scenario presentations in Europe, India, Singapore, Britain, Australia, and many African countries. He also has lectured at Harvard Business School in Boston and at the Central Party School in Beijing. Recently, he was awarded an honorary doctorate by the University of Cape Town for his work in the field of scenario planning. Thank you, Clem, and welcome.
Thank you so much, and good morning, everybody. And I would like to talk about this book. Here it is, Thinking the Future. It's a Penguin book that was published in July, and I'm very glad to say that it's been in the exclusive books bestseller lists for nonfiction. It's also sold well on Amazon in Kindle form, and yeah, it's a philosophical book about how some of the great giants of philosophy have contributed to how we should think about the future. So the subtitle is New Perspectives from the Shoulders of Giants. And what I want to do is to go through chapter by chapter to show you how you should think the future. And when I say you, I mean you as an individual or as a family, not just big companies and governments. This is written for ordinary people to improve the way that they think about the future. The book was written with Mitch Ilbury, who is Chantal Ilbury's son. Chantal and I wrote a book which was a big hit at the beginning of this century called The Mind of a Fox. And her son went to King's College in London and did a degree on strategic intelligence. He did very well. And he and I teamed up to write this book. The first chapter really deals with two philosophers and then one giant of modern times. The two philosophers are Plato and Aristotle, who had very different views on how you should picture the world. Plato felt that there was a world of ideal forms out there, and we sat in a cave seeing the shadows, and it was only if you applied real intellect that you could walk out of the cave and begin to see the ideal forms in that world that existed beyond us. Whereas Aristotle thought that actually the world that you observed was the real world, and that you should actually look around you and see what was happening and connect things together, and then over time accumulate knowledge on this world that you observed, because it was the real world. He didn't believe that there was an ideal world which you would arrive at through pure intellectual thinking. And these two views influenced philosophy for many years. And in the 1960s, a philosopher at Oxford called Isaiah Berlin wrote a book called The Hedgehog and the Fox, in which he quoted a Greek poet called Archilochus, who said, "The hedgehog knows one big thing, and the fox knows many little things." And he thought this was a very powerful metaphor because obviously Plato, with his view that you could come up with the idea of the perfect world, was a hedgehog, whereas Aristotle, who was constantly looking around him just like a bright-eyed fox, picking evidence up, changing his mind, weighing different ideas up to see which was valid, that he was a fox. And Isaiah Berlin made it very plain that he sympathized with the foxes. Well, we decided to use this analogy when we wrote the book, Chantal Ilbury and I, called The Mind of a Fox. And clearly from the title, you can see that we favored foxes as well in looking at the future, because we feel very strongly that you should entertain multiple futures, different scenarios, and weigh them up all the time as the future unfolds, rather than making a forecast which would suggest that you should bet everything on a single future. Subsequent to our book, two Americans wrote very popular books. The first was Jim Collins. He wrote a book called Good to Great, where he advocated the hedgehog approach for companies. He said, you know, if you focus on what you can do well, you can be successful. So he plumped for the hedgehog over the fox. Thank heavens he was followed by a man called Philip Tetlock, who is one of America's top futurists, who said that he studied 82,000 expert forecasts in America. And he came to the conclusion that foxes who adjusted their forecasts as the future unfolded and were flexible, like Aristotle was when he looked at the evidence around him, that they actually ended up more often than not with a more accurate picture of the future than hedgehogs, who he felt were the kind of experts who had a preordained view of the future and then stuck to it. So I guess that the opening chapter, the message is you must be flexible about the future, and you must entertain multiple futures which are different possibilities. The second chapter we devoted to another great Greek philosopher called Socrates, because he basically said you've got to question everything around you. Basic concepts like justice and truth, and you must also obviously question any political and economic view put forward. You must go back to basics. It's called the Socratic Method. And he was prepared to die for this, because he was put on trial in Athens for questioning the authorities. And he was sentenced to die, and he had to drink hemlock and poisoned himself. So he really believed in the Socratic method. And it is so important when you are faced with looking at the future that you weigh up the different possibilities, and you actually put as much energy into arguing against your favored opinion as you do in arguing in support of it. You've got to, it's like a trial. You've got to have a prosecution and a defense. And we quote one example in the second chapter of the war on Iraq in 2002, when the CIA and the MI6 in the UK both served up intelligence to George Bush on the one hand, Tony Blair on the other, saying that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. And they knew that this was the kind of information that the leaders wanted. And it was subsequently shown that this information was incorrect. There was no basic evidence that Saddam Hussein had these weapons. But it is a kind of human weakness that we tend to go for confirmation bias, serving up information that's convenient for ourselves and for the people in power. Well, the whole point of the Socratic method is to try and get away from that. Our third chapter deals with the Stoic philosophers, who are also Greeks. And everybody thinks that Stoicism is about being resilient in tough times. But what we tried to show was that the Stoic philosopher goes much, much deeper than that. In fact, he feels that the basis of happiness is to know exactly what you control and what you don't control, and then obviously do your best in that world that you don't control in order to make the world a better place. And I'd like to just quote one particular philosopher among the Stoics called Epictetus. He said, and this is over 2,000 years ago, the chief task in life is simply this: to identify and separate matters so that I can say clearly to myself which are externals, not under my control, and which have to do with the choices I actually control. Where then do I look for good and evil? Not to uncontrollable externals, but within myself, to the choices that are my own. And that is one of the critical things when looking at the future, is to make this distinction between those forces and patterns that are beyond your control and that you have to adapt to, and those things which you do have some influence over or which you do directly control. I mean, the example we quote in the book is of a man on a yacht in a storm on the ocean. You know, a Stoic looks at what he can do to alter the sails, to change his course, to get out of the storm. What he doesn't do is worry about the storm itself, which is beyond his control. Which brings me to the chapter which is probably the most important in our book. It's about the actual process that we advocate for thinking the future. And our giant in this chapter is Pierre Wack, who was a Frenchman, who went and studied under the person who was the inventor of scenario planning in the United States, an American called Herman Kahn, who lived in California and worked for the Rand Corporation, and actually wrote a book in 1960 called On Thermonuclear War, where he played a scenario of a flat-out conflict between America and Russia and showed how lethal such a conflict would be in terms of the destruction of both countries and, of course, the rest of the world. And he said he called it scenario planning because he had a few Hollywood friends who wrote scenarios of movie scripts in order to raise money. It was a summary of a movie script, which was called a scenario. And he thought, that's exactly what I'm doing with this book. I'm writing a movie script of a possible nuclear war. And so he called it a scenario. And then he added the word planning to show that it should be taken into account when you plan the future. And indeed it was, because 2 years later, America and Russia very nearly went to war over the Cuban Missile Crisis, where the Russians had planted missiles in Cuba, which the Americans considered too close to their country. And so there was a real confrontation between Khrushchev on the one side and Kennedy on the other. And it said that the book that Herman Kahn wrote influenced them not to actually embark on something that could lead to such major destruction. Anyway, Pierre then introduced scenario planning in Royal Dutch Shell, an oil company in London. And it proved very successful because he wrote a scenario in the late 1970s of a massive rise in the oil price, which turned out to be correct. And Shell management bet on it and made a lot of money. And it came to our attention as one of the largest mining companies in the world that this process could be used. And if it could be used for oil, it could possibly be used for the future of gold and diamonds and all the other commodities we produced. So we asked Pierre to come to Johannesburg because he was about to retire from Shell and give us a lecture at 44 Main Street, our headquarters, to our executive committee. I was the secretary of the executive committee at the time. And he bewitched our directors, and the chairman, Gavin Reddy, turned to me and said, in addition to your normal mining responsibilities, would you mind looking after scenario planning? And I said, that's fine, Gavin. And I had this privilege of working with Pierre for over 10 years. And he really did the job. In the middle of the 1980s, we wrote both global and South African scenarios of what could happen in the 1990s. And among the global scenarios, we had one called Imperial Twilight, where the Soviet Union basically disappeared because of being bankrupted by the arms race. Well, it wasn't quite like that. It was more to do with Gorbachev wanting to dismantle the Soviet Union, but it happened by 1990. That's when the Berlin Wall came tumbling down. But on the South African scenarios, Pierre was brilliant, and he had 3 steps to his methodology. He said, first, you've got to work out what the rules of the game are that apply to the topic on which you're writing scenarios. And he said, it's not like a game of sport. It's not like cricket or rugby or soccer, where the rules don't change that much over a period of time. He said that in real life, the rules can change dramatically. And what you're looking at are the rules of the game that will govern in future, not in the past. What are the forces that are driving the present into the future that apply under all scenarios? And we had 2 rules of the game that we identified for South African scenarios in the mid-1980s. The first was what we called the equilibrium of violence, because the government of the day had all the weapons, military weapons at their disposal, but of course the ANC had the numbers. And therefore neither side would win quickly in a civil war. All that would happen would be the equilibrium of violence would rise. And the second rule of the game, we said, is statutory apartheid must go in all its forms if we are to be accepted back into the world at large. There was no sort of compromise that would lead to the ending of sanctions. Those were our 2 rules of the game. Pierre then said, having established the rules of the game, you've got to look at the key uncertainties, those forces that can drive the future in one direction or the other. And of course, the principal uncertainty at the time was what was going to be the economic and political strategies of the National Party and the government on the one hand, and of the ANC and other parties on the other hand. And we then developed 2 scenarios for the future of South Africa, rising from those rules of the game and those key uncertainties. The positive one we called the high road of negotiation leading to a political settlement, and us getting back into the world at large. And the other scenario was the low road of increasing confrontation leading to civil war and a wasteland. And having delivered these scenarios to the workforce inside Anglo, I was asked with a couple of my colleagues to give lectures around the country in 1986 and 87. And basically the scenarios did what movie scripts are supposed to do. They influenced the conversation. People were given the choice. It wasn't like being given a forecast and somebody saying there's a 20% probability that we'll take a high road. Nobody's really motivated by that. Rather, give them different possible futures, and then they can think about it for themselves. And of course, a lot of people in the mid-1980s felt the high road was impossible because the ANC and the National Party would never have peaceful negotiations. But they did. And it showed that this methodology can capture some fairly extreme futures, which at the time were thought unimaginable. So that is the technique that is advocated in the 4th chapter of our book. In the 5th chapter, we say you can't just do scenarios. You must, in fact, look at the flags which are indicating which scenario is coming into play. And we base this on an Austrian British philosopher called Karl Popper, who introduced in a book the concept of clouds and clocks. He said clocks are the phenomena in the world that are fairly predictable, like the ticking of a clock. Clouds are like those in the sky, where they change shape in an unpredictable way during the daytime. And he said the world is made up of this continuum from very, very uncertain events to very certain events. And we feel that is a valid idea to use in the scenario planning process by attaching flags to our different scenarios and seeing whether they come up, and if they do, whether that increases the probability of the scenario. The very obvious one in the case of South Africa in the 1980s was the release of Nelson Mandela. I actually went and saw him in prison in January 1990 at Victor Verster near Paarl, because he wanted to hear about the high road and low road scenarios. And he didn't tell me that he was going to be released, but it certainly was a flag for me to talk to him about the future. And of course, a month later, he was released, which was a very green flag in favor of the high road scenario. So, yeah, you must add flags to the scenarios. Our next chapter deals with a weakness we have, which is expressed in a quote by a Scottish philosopher called David Hume. "Reason is the slave of passion, and should be so," he said. And what he was trying to get at was that we have these two sides to the human character. We have our intellectual, analytical side, we have our emotional side. And the chances are that our emotional side dominates our intellectual side on most occasions. But that is why it is so important to use the Socratic method in terms of questioning the evidence for the scenarios. And as I said, to use flags which can prick that veil of emotion that we have when we look at the future. Al Gore referred to climate change as an inconvenient truth. And we tend to look away from inconvenient truths. And the whole point about our technique is to look an inconvenient truth right in the face and then say, what are we going to do about it if the probability of that particular scenario actually increases? So, yeah, the reason he felt that passion should rule reason was that we do things because of passion. Faith and passion are the source of most action in human beings, rather than just analyzing and being mathematical or doing things like that. You do need emotion. So he was quite happy to accept that reason should be the slave of passion. Which brings me to one of the great biologists of all time, Charles Darwin. He's the giant of our next chapter, because he came up with the origin of the species and the principle of survival of the fittest. But what most people don't realize is that when he said survival of the fittest, he did not mean the survival of the most powerful species on Earth. He meant survival of the species the most fit in with the changing environment around them. And it was those species that adapted that would outlast species that didn't adapt. And as we show in this chapter, we are very good at adapting, but we also are very good at innovation, which is coming up with completely new ideas and products to help us move and progress into the future. But foxes are naturally adaptive to all the things, as the Stoic philosophers would say, are beyond your control. The next chapter, equally important, is one we call the ethical compass, because it is very important when you are considering the future, and particularly considering what you're going to do in the future, to look at the ethical compass. And we make the point that there is a difference between being legal and ethical. And you have to use this lens to firstly consider what is the positive and what is the negative scenario in moral terms, but equally you've got to use it to decide what actions you can choose. And we show in the chapter at the moment that big tech, all those big companies like Facebook and Twitter and Apple and others, are under immense pressure because they've got so much power in the world that they must be ethical in their relationship with customers and with all the much smaller companies with which they interact. The second to last chapter is again one of our most important chapters. We call it Thinking and Doing. And the two giants of this chapter are Nelson Mandela and Steve Jobs of Apple fame. Because what we're basically saying is, even though our book is concentrates on the process of thinking the future, you actually only become great if you do at the same time. In fact, Steve Jobs talked about thinker-doers are the great people because they put a ding, as he called it, a ding into the universe. And of course, Nelson Mandela showed that quality when he came out of prison. It wasn't just that he had conversations in prison. He immediately got down to negotiation. Whenever talks were about to break down, he and de Klerk stepped in and revived them. And he got the results of a settlement and then our first democratic election. He thought in prison, and then he did when he was released. And the same applies to Steve Jobs. He basically was brilliant at design of products. He teamed up with people who are brilliant in terms of the inner workings of the product. And they produced all these wonderful products. And he made one point which I've always thought was quite interesting, because it really goes to show that he was a great person, because he left Apple in the mid-80s because he had a row with the CEO over the Macintosh. And when he returned after spending time with Next and with Pixar, he said this: "The heaviness of being successful was replaced by the lightness of being a beginner again. Less sure of everything, it freed me to enter one of the most creative periods of my life." And of course, that was when he produced the iPod, the iPad, the iPhone, and all the other things. So yeah, you have to you have to actually do things. Our final chapter is about education and the fact that, you know, we've never had this real Socratic conversation around education, whether it has adapted to the century that we're living in and away from the century that we've just passed through. Because there are some things which have completely changed. I mean, one of them is the nature of work for which you're preparing students. In the last century, big business was the major creator of jobs around the world. But then long came automation and robots and artificial intelligence, and all those jobs have been destroyed. And so the principal creator of jobs nowadays is small business. And I wonder how many schools are saying to their pupils, you know, you don't get a job now by waving your CV in front of a big business. You create a job with a group of your mates by thinking up something original which you can sell into the market, and then, you know, starting a business. Or you create a charitable organization that's going to do useful work in society. And so in terms of what is probably one of the most important things, education must teach young people how to think about their future, because if you think about it, they've got a longer future than adults, and therefore it is a more valuable process. So now I'd just like to apply it to two subjects that we talk about in the book. The first is the environment, and particularly in light of Glasgow, which is happening right now, COP26, looking at what people can do to restrict the increase in temperature of our planet to 1.5 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels. And then the second thing, I'd like to show how it applies to South Africa. In the book, we say there are really two rules of the game looking forward on climate change. The first is that this is the very first time that the world has to fully cooperate with one another. I mean, if you look at our history, we've had wars and rivalry and competition, we've had conflict, we've had all those things. Well, this issue demands that the whole world cooperate, because if part of the world does not cooperate, then the whole initiative is useless. So it is an incredibly important rule of the game that nations cooperate with one another. The second rule of the game is that there has to be sufficient money to move from being a fossil fuel economy to a green economy. And that means that rich nations are going to have to subsidize the poorer nations on the planet in order to achieve a positive outcome in terms of keeping climate change in check. Those are two rules that apply to all scenarios. The key uncertainty, obviously, is whether you're going to see nations cooperate, and particularly America cooperating with China. As was mentioned in my CV, I've done presentations on scenario planning at Harvard Business School, but also at the Central Party School in Beijing, which is the leadership academy for the Chinese Communist Party. And I can tell you that the culture of Americans and Chinese are completely different to one another. The Americans are democratic, very much individualistic. The Chinese are autocratic and collectivist. And you just wonder how much this is going to stand in the way of the kind of relationship that the two leading carbon emitters in the world have to forge with one another in order to create a positive scenario for the future of this planet. But it's not just America and China, which is an uncertainty. There are other countries like Russia and India and Brazil and Africa we've all got to cooperate, and there's a big uncertainty around that. And then the second big uncertainty is that scientists don't actually know what the rate of climate change is. They'll say one thing to you, which is we were all wrong about one thing, which is that we thought this was all going to happen in the second half of this century, that you would start seeing extreme weather patterns, extreme rainfall, extreme drought. You'd start to see sea levels rising to unacceptable levels, and that would all start from 2050 onwards. Well, actually, it's happening now, and their models were wrong. And so the question is, the uncertainty is, are we going to see a major increase in temperatures over the next 10 to 15 years? Nobody really knows because we haven't got proper models. And this leads to 4 scenarios that we paint in the book. The first we call Paradise Regained, John Milton, title of a book, where you have a green commitment, proper green commitment to changing the economies around the world, and you also have a united world. So you have those 2 critical conditions to create this. And what commitment means is setting measurable targets and then measuring whether they're achieved, and if they aren't achieved, making sure that something happens next to get the whole process back into order again. The second scenario is where you have a united world, but you have green apathy. As Greta Thunberg, that young Swedish lady, said the other day, blah, blah, blah. That's what she thinks COP26 will be. Well, if you have blah, 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 even in a united world, you end up with a scenario which we call paradise lost. It's the opportunity to do what is right is simply missed. And then we have 2 further scenarios for a divided world. If China and America never get together, and if the rest of the world doesn't come together, there are 2 further scenarios. One is called Isolated Edens. It's where a few countries, maybe Scandinavian countries, try to create isolated Edens where they keep their own country and try and protect it from the worst of climate change. But in the long run, it won't work because, as I said earlier on, a rule of the game is that everybody comes to the party. But the last scenario is the really worrying one. We call it pandemonium. It's where you see millions, maybe even billions of refugees fleeing from countries that have become uninhabitable to get into countries that are habitable. And, people talk about illegal immigrants now, but that is nothing compared with what will happen if the world really does experience terrible weather. You're then going to see those hundreds of thousands that are queuing up at the Mexican border and border of Poland and elsewhere. You're going to see them suddenly being expanded into millions, and as I said, maybe even billions of people. You'll have wars on water, and you'll see coastal cities beginning to disappear, like New Orleans and London and other cities. That is the pandemonium scenario. And actually, we feel it's much better to think of this whole issue in terms of these scenarios, which, as I said, are movie scripts of the future, than it is to just say, well, we forecast that there's only a 30% probability of temperatures rising beyond 1.5 degrees centigrade. That doesn't really mean anything to anybody, and it's certainly not going to motivate them into action, because one of the critical things we say is that it's what ordinary people do to reduce their carbon footprint which is going to make a difference in the future. Of course, it's also about governments, but it's about what ordinary people do, and particularly rich people who have a much bigger carbon footprint than poor people. Which brings me on to the South African scenarios. And this is what we say is a rule of the game for the South African scenarios. And it's very important, this rule. We say South Africa right now stands at an economic crossroads after years of corruption and state capture, combined with the disruptive impact of COVID-19. The treasury is virtually empty, and this is unlikely to change anytime soon. We are at a tipping point where the path we take in the immediate future could define our future for decades. And then we offer two scenarios. The first scenario we call people's economy, to convey the message that the work achieved by Nelson Mandela and others constitutes unfinished business. In this sequel, the country now achieves economic freedom for all as a necessary complement to political freedom. The second scenario we call cautionary tale. Here, South Africa experiences rising popular anger caused by an economy that is stagnant, exclusive, and cursed by a dismally high unemployment rate. This leads to further disunity and widespread violence, with a possible endpoint of total anarchy in the chain of causation. We saw that about a month after we published this book, with the terrible destruction of shopping malls and other property in KZN and in Gauteng. But of course, there was that incredible pushback by communities in terms of protecting other property and also in terms of cleaning up, which showed the best side of South Africa. So those are the two scenarios. And one of the biggest flags, I think, for the people's economy scenario will be if Cyril Ramaphosa sets up a panel like he's had for the epidemic, the medical expert panel, to guide him on the decisions that government should make in terms of keeping the coronavirus in check, that we should have a similar panel on the economic recovery. And it should be made up of entrepreneurial experts, because that's how South Africa's economy is going to become inclusive, is to create a whole new wave of young entrepreneurs around the country. And he needs that kind of wisdom from people like Adrian Gore of Discovery. Maybe we might even get somebody like Elon Musk of Tesla, who was educated at Pretoria Boys High. We need the people who've actually been through the process of actually setting up businesses. And he then needs to go on television and report to the public at large on what we're doing to create this people's economy, what measures are going to be put in place over the next 6 months, and then he's got to give a progress report, because our recovery is as important as handling the pandemic. There are other flags as well. It's going to be what big business does to help small business, and whether they're going to allocate a small part of their supply chain to nurturing new entrepreneurs. It's going to be about whether we have stock exchanges in all the major cities where entrepreneurs can raise money by putting their company on this particular website and then using crowdfunding to raise money for their companies and issuing shares to the public. It's going to be about the banks getting together to organize micro lending on a major scale in rural and urban areas, just like they have in Bangladesh with the Grameen Bank. These would all be very positive flags to show that we are moving towards a people's economy. I did a debate with Julius Malema back in February 2016 at the Cape Sun. It was very enjoyable, and it was called Rumble in the Urban Jungle. It was a dinner organized by the Cape Town Chamber of Commerce. And I said to Julius, I only differ with you in one respect, which is the definition of economic freedom, because I'm as much of an economic freedom fighter as you are, Julius. I don't want to nationalize the banks and the mines and take away the land. Obviously, I want things to be reformed, But what I really want to do is improve the economic freedom of ordinary people in this country. That's how you turn it into a great economy. When I walked around the Central Party School in Beijing after doing the talk on scenario planning there, because they show very few foreigners around their school because very few are invited there. One of the things that really struck me was that they'd taken down the slogans of Mao Zedong and replaced them with slogans of Deng Xiaoping. And when I asked one of the professors why, he said, because when Deng came into power in 1978, we were the 100th ranked economy in the world. Now we're number 5. And of course, now they're number 2 and heading for number 1. And he said, Deng said 2 things to us. We, the Communist Party, have to make sure that the platform in China is really effective. And we're going to have to build the bridges and the airports and the power stations and all this kind of stuff. That's our responsibility as government. But he says the second thing is we've got to allow individual Chinese to create wealth for themselves. And those 2 things, this professor said, have driven us to have this economic miracle. Well, in a sense, the same is true here. We've got to make ESCOM work, and the government's got to do that, and we've got to have good a platform, but then we've got to really release the incredible entrepreneurial spirit that exists in this country. I mean, the reason America's been number 1 is not so much the presidents and politicians. It's because they had people like Henry Ford introducing the first mass production vehicle, Walt Disney with the first cartoon, Bill Gates with computer operating systems, Steve Jobs with all the devices that we now use. That's the kind of path that we now require to lead to a people's economy. So I hope I've entertained you this morning. I hope I've given you a real model, which is in this book, Thinking the Future. You can get it at a South African bookshop or on the internet. And then lastly, I hope I've shown you how it can work with 2 of the big issues of today, climate change and what we do next in South Africa. And I'd like to leave you with a benediction. May the fox be with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Clem, for your very insightful presentation and sharing knowledge that we can take away to ponder about in the future. So colleagues, we are running over time. Mr. Sunter has offered to stay on longer than the 45 minutes so that we can do the question and answers. But first, I'm just going to do the lucky prize draw so that colleagues who need to leave the meeting can do so. So I'm just going to draw a name out. So the winner of our Take a Lot voucher is Moriti Joe Poshoko, who is the CEO of Disa Business Enterprise. So congratulations, Moriti. Your Take a Lot voucher will be on its way to you shortly. So colleagues, we are going to commence now with the question and answer session for Mr. Sunter. So Clem, Karen asks, could Plato and Aristotle both be on the right track, that there is something to be said for both views of the world?
Yeah, look, absolutely. You know, I'm a fox. I don't believe that you should have an absolute view about free market economies and an absolute view about communism and socialism. That what you're aiming for is a pragmatic mixture of these different beliefs. I remember that Nelson Mandela opened his conversation with me in prison by saying, the one thing I really liked about your book on the high road, low road was you quoted Deng Xiaoping saying, I don't care if a cat is black or white as long as it catches mice. He said, that's what I'm about. Producing things that work. So yeah, I do believe that there's something to be drawn from, different ideologies. And what you mustn't be is too ideological. And unfortunately, social media these days have polarized people. They only look at websites that that are consistent with their ideology, whereas actually we've got to have a conversation. Sorry, I can't hear you.
Sorry. So the next question is, can individual figures be forces as well, in the sense that they happen to the future in good and bad ways, and it's not just the future happening to individuals?
Yeah, you know, one of the points that we make is there is an overlap between the circle that we do not control and the circle we control. And of course, the activists are very good at looking at that sort of little sliver of influence that we use between the two circles to change the world at large. And so it's I think the Stoical model is a very good beginning. And it shows that you've got to concentrate on those actions which you think will actually reach through into that circle that you do not control. And more, because of social media, you know, meaning people share information which leads to new movements that we all know about, like Black Lives Matter and Me Too. Ordinary people can get together now and change the world.
So the next question is, would you hazard a scenario projection for South Africa now?
Well, you know, I've given you the two scenarios: people's economy, or the cautionary tale of increasing conflict and anarchy. And yeah, I haven't changed since Mitch and I wrote the book. Obviously, our probability at the start of that looting, which happened in KZN and Gauteng, we upped the probability on the cautionary tale scenario, but thank heavens the response was so spectacular that we've gone back to thinking that a people's economy is a perfectly reasonable possibility if Cyril Ramaphosa can step up and establish a kind of council of entrepreneurial experts and then report regularly to the public on what we're doing to create a people's economy.
Okay, so given the current political and strained economic climate, what scenarios lie ahead for South Africa?
Well, it's actually tougher than people think at the moment, because, you know, up till today, every generation has had an improved quality of life because of the advance in technology. This is the first time that human beings as a species are facing a really serious challenge to their existence, because, make no mistake, there's no alternative. You know, we can't blast off to another planet because A, that we don't know of one, and secondly, it's too far away. So, you know, we have to make do with what we've got. And as William Shatner said when he went up in that rocket of Jeff Bezos, and he was in Star Wars, if you remember, he was the sort of star guy, the commander. He said that what really interested him about his very short flight into space was just how thin the atmosphere is. And you move from kind of blue sky on Earth into the blackness of space. And yeah, he said, you know, we live on a very fragile planet. So, you know, the scenario right now is tough, because nobody yet has done a proper narrative of what it really means to move towards a carbon-free economy. We all talk about it, but we don't know the details. And yes, we talk about electric cars, but then somebody's got to build all the electric points around the country that you can charge your vehicle, because we won't be able to fill up with petrol. And then you've got to obviously build the cars themselves. And then you've got to provide the electricity. Is Eskom suddenly going to have to move to wind power and solar energy and nuclear energy and away from fossil fuels, that all takes time. And so, there's a lot of great things that have been said at this conference in Glasgow, but it's another thing to work out the kind of detailed narrative that a scenario requires. As I said, it's like a movie script, to actually make sure that we move away from fossil fuels. And some countries haven't signed up, like Australia, because coal is the second largest export from Australia, and they don't want to suddenly stop that industry, which is just north of Sydney and provides, tens of thousands of jobs.
So another question is, what is the high and low road for South Africa in the next 3 to 5 years? Will we as individuals see the light at the end of the tunnel, or would corruption continue to be the order of the day? Do we look at alternatives across the globe for the future, that being our children or grandchildren?
Well, I personally feel that we are living in a different environment to 5 to 10 years ago, when corruption was rife. There's no doubt that the tribunals we've had have done a good job in exposing it. I do believe that Cyril is very conscious of what he has to do. And one of the most important things is that we've run out of money. For whatever reason, we've run out. And so we're now facing reality, just like we're facing reality with these load shedding that we have at the moment. People are going to have to do a genuine job to turn this country around. And I come back to my point about what happened 2 months ago. We had that incredibly negative thing of lots of small businesses and shops being ruined. And then we had the very positive thing that people came together, not because they were ordered to by the authorities, but on a voluntary basis to stop the looting and rioting, and then obviously to help clean up. So there is this incredible spirit of teamwork that exists in South Africa. And that's why I do believe, with the kind of flags that I've identified, we can actually change our path to the people's economy. And just remember, we are the most advanced industrialized economy in Africa. And Africa is one of the most exciting continents on the planet, with a young population. And it's much better being here, for example, than being in Europe, where you have an aging population and low economic growth rates. South Africa is a stunning place for foreign companies and local companies to look into the rest of Africa and sell products into those markets.
So colleagues, the last question that we have here is, does climate change require a new way of thinking, a new idea or ideological thought process that encompasses social, market, physical, abstract, and logical elements? And how does population growth or change influence these factors?
Yeah, well, the point is this, that, this is the first century that we've had 8 billion people on this planet. I mean, in 1920, it was 2 billion. So we've gone up by a factor of 4 to 8 billion. And even with 8 billion people now, the planet is beginning to get crowded, as we see from climate change. Obviously, any kind of population management measures would be hugely controversial, because people have a right to have as many babies as they choose. It's a fundamental human right. But thank heavens, the United Nations models show that as countries get richer, their population growth declines, and they even feel that we could actually have a flat population at the end of the century at around 10.5 billion people. But in terms of the profound nature of the question and whether our philosophy should change, absolutely it has to change, because up till now, the critical part of success has been economic development, material prosperity, and obviously the other side of philosophy, moral philosophy, and those things as well. And this is going to have to be turned upside down, because if we all go on in an unblinded fashion, in a blinded fashion to pursue economic prosperity, we're going to ruin our planet. So yes, this requires a complete rethink on what a successful life is all about. And sustainability of our planet is now going to enter that equation big time.
So colleagues, we have reached the end of our Q&A session. So in conclusion, I would like to thank Clem for his brilliant talk and sharing great insights with us. Thank you to all of you colleagues who joined the PURCO Essay Ponder presentation this morning. And thank you to my colleague Davey for assisting us in hosting the event. Thank you so much, Clem. Thank you, colleagues, and goodbye.
Bye-bye.